She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull him aside. Victoria Langford stood in the middle of Terminal C at Harlow International Airport, surrounded by gate agents, passengers, camera crews, and half her executive team, and she pointed her finger at Ethan Mercer like he was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Kneel," she said. "Kneel and apologize, or walk out that door and never come back." The concourse went silent. A woman near Gate 14 stopped mid-sentence. A TSA officer turned around. Ethan stood there in his worn navy jacket, a coffee still in his hand, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe is real. He didn't kneel. If this is your first time here, you're going to want to stay until the very end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Ethan Mercer had been getting up at 5 in the morning for 11 years. Not because he loved mornings, he didn't, not particularly, but because that was the hour his daughter Lily needed her inhaler before school. And if he waited until 6, she'd wake up coughing, and he'd spend the rest of the morning feeling like he'd failed her before breakfast. She was 9 now. Brown hair, his mother's eyes, and a stubbornness that he suspected she'd inherited from both sides. She had a poster of the solar system above her bed and a collection of paper airplanes lined up on her windowsill that she and Ethan had folded together on Sunday night since she was 5. She liked planes. He'd never told her that some of them scared the hell out of him. Ethan was a federal aviation safety inspector, or had been, until 6 months ago when a budget restructuring had forced him out of the government position he'd held for 9 years. He'd landed at Continental Vantage Airlines as an independent certification consultant, which was the kind of job title that meant almost nothing to most people and everything to the industry. His role was simple in description, impossible in practice. He reviewed maintenance records, inspected aircraft, and either certified them as airworthy or didn't. No aircraft under his current contract with Continental Vantage could legally depart without passing through his process first. It was a quiet kind of power. He'd never thought of it that way. He thought of it as a responsibility. The morning of the incident, a Tuesday in late March, cold enough that the tarmac still had frost on it in the shadows, Ethan arrived at Harlow International at 6:42. He badged through the maintenance access gate, exchanged nods with 2 ground crew workers he recognized, and went straight to the hangar where Flight 881 was being prepped. Continental Vantage Flight 881 was a transatlantic departure, non-stop to Frankfurt, scheduled to push back at 9:15. It was carrying a full load, 218 passengers, mostly business class up front, economy packed tight in the back, plus 11 crew. Ethan had reviewed the preliminary records the night before, sitting at his kitchen table after Lily went to sleep. Something had nagged at him. Not an obvious problem, not the kind of thing that jumps off the page and shouts, more like a small inconsistency. A maintenance notation that referred to a landing gear inspection completed on March 3rd, signed off by a senior technician named Roy Calloway. But when Ethan cross-referenced the shift logs for that date, Calloway had been on approved leave. He hadn't been in the building. It could have been a clerical error. It happened. People made typos, misstated forms, logged things incorrectly. 9 times out of 10, that's all it was. But Ethan had built his entire career on being the one person who checks the 10th time. He pulled up the aircraft's physical inspection record when he reached the hangar. The plane, a wide body, about 7 years old, solid aircraft under normal circumstances, was sitting under the overhead lights while 2 mechanics moved around the wings. Ethan signed in, strapped on his flashlight, and started at the nose wheel. He found it 40 minutes later. Not dramatic. Not obvious. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. A hairline fracture along the inner housing of the portside main landing gear assembly. The kind of fracture that holds up fine on the ground. The kind that can propagate under the cyclical stress of a 6-hour transatlantic flight and a hard landing on a cold Frankfurt runway into something catastrophic. Ethan crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up, took out his phone, and photographed it from 6 different angles. Then he walked to the inspection desk, sat down, opened the maintenance log, and started reading backward through every entry for this aircraft going back 4 months. By 8:15, he had a problem. The fracture was real. But more than that, the The documentation around it was wrong in ways that weren't accidental. 3 separate maintenance inspections that should have caught this defect were listed as completed and signed off. 2 of the signatures were from technicians who, per the shift logs, weren't on duty when the inspection supposedly occurred. One was signed by Roy Calloway, the same man who'd been on leave the week before. And the parts notation for a landing gear component replacement logged in January listed a part number that, when Ethan looked it up, corresponded to a component from a non-certified supplier. Not a gray market, exactly, but not the approved parts chain Continental Vantage was required to use under their operating certificate. He sat with that for a few minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called the maintenance supervisor on duty, a man named Gerald Pham. Gerald answered on the 3rd ring, already sounding like he was managing 4 things at once. "Gerald, it's Ethan Mercer. I'm down at Hangar 7 with Flight 881. "Yeah, she's almost ready for push. We're on schedule." "She's not going," Ethan said, a pause. "Sorry?" "The aircraft isn't getting my certification this morning. There's a structural issue with the port landing gear, and I've got documentation problems I need to escalate before anything else happens." 881 stays on the ground. The silence on Gerald's end lasted about 4 seconds. Then, "Ethan, we've got 218 passengers checking in right now. We've got a 9:15 departure. You understand what a ground stop on this flight means at this hour?" "I do," Ethan said. "The aircraft doesn't fly." He hung up. What happened next moved fast in the way that airport emergencies always move. Not chaotically, but with a kind of accelerating seriousness, like a current picking up speed. Within 20 minutes, Gerald had called his director. His director had called operations. Operations had escalated to the vice president of fleet management, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla Simmons, who met Ethan in the maintenance office at 8:40 and looked at his photographs and his documentation cross-references without saying anything for a long moment. "These records look bad," she said finally. "They are bad," Ethan said. "This isn't a paperwork glitch, Carla. Someone logged inspections that didn't happen and signed names of people who weren't there. The fracture alone would have been a serious issue. The falsified records make this a federal matter." Carla exhaled through her nose. "Do you know how much a delayed transatlantic departure costs us?" "I know how much a failed landing gear at 30,000 feet costs," Ethan said. "Everybody in this room does." She looked at him. She was not a stupid woman, and he knew it. She'd been in aviation for 20 years. She understood exactly what he was saying, but she also had a phone that was buzzing on the table between them, and the name on the screen was one she couldn't ignore. She answered it. He watched her face change. Victoria Langford had built Continental Vantage from a mid-sized regional carrier into one of the 12 largest airlines in North America over the course of 14 years. She was 61, precise in her presentation, and not known for patience with obstacles. She'd fired a VP of operations on a phone call once for missing a quarterly projection by 4%. She'd restructured the entire boarding process across 200 routes in 8 weeks because a consultant's report suggested a 3-minute improvement in turnaround time. She ran the airline the way a chess player runs a board, always several moves ahead, always certain that the variables she could see were the ones that mattered. She arrived at Harlow International at 9:05, 40 minutes before she'd been expected, in a black SUV with 2 members of her communications team and her executive assistant. She walked through Terminal C with the specific kind of authority that makes people move without being asked. By 9:12, she was in the operations hub adjacent to the gate for Flight 881, and Carla Simmons was standing next to her, and the gate agents outside were dealing with 218 passengers who'd been told to step away from the boarding doors. Ethan was asked to come in. He came. Victoria looked at him from across the table. She was in a charcoal blazer and a white blouse, and she had the polished, slightly brittle quality of someone who had been very attractive at 40 and was now, at 61, more formidable than attractive and knew it. She looked at him the way she probably looked at budget projections that came in overestimate. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm going to be very direct with you." "That'd be fine," Ethan said. "You have grounded one of our most important international routes based on what appears to be, from the documentation I've been shown, a minor notation irregularity and a surface condition on a component that our senior maintenance team has assessed as non-critical." Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry. Who assessed it as non-critical?" Our head of maintenance, Dennis Wu. Dennis Wu hasn't been to that hangar this morning. I've been there since 6:42. Nobody from your senior maintenance team has physically inspected that aircraft since I flagged it at 8:15. Victoria's expression didn't change. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to ask you to reconsider your position. Recertify this aircraft for departure, and we can discuss the documentation concerns through the appropriate internal channels. The appropriate channel for falsified maintenance records is the FAA, Ethan said, not an internal working group. The temperature in the room dropped. One of the communications people shifted their weight. I want to be clear about what I'm telling you, Victoria said. Your contract with Continental Vantage is renewable on a quarterly basis. We're 60 days from your next renewal period. I understand that. Then I hope you also understand that the position you're taking this morning has significant implications for your professional relationship with this airline. Ethan looked at her. He was 44, not tall, with the kind of tired around his eyes that comes from years of early mornings and the specific weight of raising a child alone. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches, but he'd looked at that fracture in the landing gear for a long time that morning, and he'd thought about what the failure cascade would look like at landing. He'd done the math in his head the way he always did, the way he couldn't not do. I understand the implications just fine, he said. My answer is no. Flight 881 doesn't fly. Victoria leaned back. The decision she made in the next 30 seconds was one she would spend a long time thinking about afterward, in the specific way that people think about moments when they chose wrong and knew it even as they were choosing. She stood up and walked out of the operations hub and into the gate area, where the passengers had been staged in a roped-off section near the windows, where 3 gate agents were managing questions and the noise level was climbing. Her communications team followed her. Carla Simmons followed her. And after a moment, Ethan followed too, because one of the agents had gestured for him to come. The gate area of Terminal C at Harlow International was not a small space. It was a wide, high-ceilinged concourse with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out onto the tarmac, connected to the broader terminal flow where people moved in steady streams on their way to other gates. There were passengers everywhere. There were airline staff everywhere. There were 2 camera crews from different local news affiliates who'd gotten wind of something happening at Gate 37 and had positioned themselves at the edge of the roped area. Victoria Langford walked to the center of that space and turned to face Ethan Mercer. Mr. Mercer, she said, and her voice was loud enough that it didn't need to be. It carried. This airline has treated you professionally and compensated you generously for what amounts to a consulting role with limited scope. This morning, you have single-handedly held up a fully certified passenger-ready aircraft and disrupted the travel plans of over 200 people based on paperwork concerns that your own experience should tell you fall within normal operational variance. Ethan said nothing. He was watching her, and there was something careful in his stillness. I am prepared to allow this situation to conclude with your professional dignity intact, Victoria continued. But I need you to acknowledge here and now, in front of these passengers and this team, that your judgment this morning was an error. I need you to apologize for the disruption you've caused. And I would ask, as a condition of that resolution, that you do so sincerely. She let a beat pass. Kneel, she said. Kneel and apologize, and we put this behind us. The concourse went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something happens that people are not sure they witnessed correctly. One of the gate agents, young woman, maybe 24, been on the job 8 months, looked at her colleague and found that her colleague was looking at her with the same expression. Ethan stood there. He had the coffee cup still in his left hand. He'd been holding it since the operations meeting and had never taken a drink. He looked at Victoria Langford with an expression that wasn't anger exactly, and wasn't surprise exactly, and was mostly just a kind of deliberate quiet. No, he said. Victoria's jaw shifted. Mr. Mercer, I'm not going to do that, he said. I'm also not going to recertify that aircraft. And as of right now, I'm terminating my contract with Continental Vantage. He said it without theater, just the flat, clear shape of it. I'll submit the formal documentation within the hour. But you should know, and I want everyone in this concourse to hear this, since that seems to be how we're doing things today, that without my active certification authority, every aircraft on your current operational queue that's pending my sign-off is grounded. Not by me anymore. By the legal structure of your operating certificate. I don't have to do anything else. I just have to leave. He set the coffee cup down on the edge of the gate agent's podium. He looked at Victoria Langford for one more second. Then he turned and walked toward the terminal exit. The camera operators, who had been recording since Victoria started talking, tracked him the entire way. He called Lily's school from the parking structure, standing next to his truck in the cold. He didn't know why. She was in class. She couldn't answer. He just needed to hear the phone ring somewhere that had nothing to do with what had just happened. He'd been the one who drove her to school that morning. She'd fallen asleep in the back seat and talked to him half awake about a science project, something about weather patterns and how clouds form. And he'd listened and answered and thought about the fracture report open on his phone. He hadn't told her about any of it, obviously. She was 9. She knew he worked with airplanes, and she thought that was cool, and he wanted it to stay that way for as long as possible. He sat in his truck for a while. His phone started ringing. The first call was from a number he didn't recognize. Then another. Then a text from his former FAA supervisor, a man named Tom Bryce who'd been retired for 2 years, that said, "I'm seeing something on the news. Call me." Then a call from a journalist whose name he recognized from an aviation safety beat he'd followed for years. Then a call from a blocked number. He turned the phone over and put it face down on the passenger seat. He thought about the fracture, the way it ran along the inner housing, barely visible without the right light and the right angle, the way it would have held through the takeoff, probably through the cruise altitude. The stress loads on landing, the hard jolt of a commercial aircraft meeting a runway at speed, the weight transfer, the hydraulic compression, that's where it would have gone. That's where the numbers went bad. He'd been in aviation long enough to have attended 2 accident briefings for events that shouldn't have happened. He'd sat in rooms where investigators laid out the sequence, step by step, what failed, when, why, what the last moments in the cockpit data looked like. He'd seen the manifests. He'd done the math on the numbers. How many people on board? How many made it? He picked his phone back up and called Tom Bryce. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said. Tom's voice was careful. "CNN's running footage from the airport. Woman in a blazer pointing at you, asking you to kneel. The clip is about 40 seconds. It's already got 250,000 views." Ethan closed his eyes. "The news is also saying Continental Vantage is calling it a minor procedural dispute, and that you resigned over a difference of opinion on documentation standards," Tom said. "I found a fracture in the port landing gear and 3 months of falsified inspection records," Ethan said. "That's what happened." Tom didn't say anything for a moment. "You submitted the report?" "Filed it with the regional FAA office at 8:50 this morning, before the confrontation. They have everything. Photos, the cross-reference shift logs, the parts documentation." "Okay," Tom said. "Okay, good." Another pause. "Ethan, do you understand what's about to happen?" "I'm starting to." "The certification structure you held, the specific delegated authority under your contract. I've been making some calls since I saw the news. Apparently nobody at Continental Vantage fully mapped what happens operationally if that authority lapses without a transition in place. Their legal team is going to figure it out in the next..." Ethan's phone buzzed. He pulled it away from his ear and looked at the screen. It was the Continental Vantage COO's office. Then it buzzed again. FAA Regional Director. Then again, unknown number. He put the phone back to his ear. "Tom, I have to go." "Call me back," Tom said. "And Ethan, you did the right thing." Ethan looked out through the windshield at the gray March sky, at the planes lined up on the tarmac in the distance, still and grounded and going nowhere. "I know," he said. He answered the next call. Inside Terminal C, 218 passengers who'd been expecting to land in Frankfurt at 9 the following morning were beginning to understand that nothing about this day was going to go the way they'd planned. The gate agents were fielding questions they didn't have answers to because the operations hub was no longer answering their calls. And the flight status board that should have shown a departure time was showing something that most of the passengers had never seen before on a continental carrier at a major American hub. It showed, "Hold. Certification review. No time estimate. No rebooking instructions. Just that." A woman in the back of the waiting area took a video of the board and posted it. It got 3,000 shares in the first hour. Victoria Langford, somewhere between the gate and her SUV and the executive parking bay, was on a phone call with her legal team that was not going well. And in Hangar 7, Under the cold overhead lights, Flight 881 sat exactly where Ethan had left it. Engines cold, doors sealed, port landing gear holding a fracture that nobody official had yet put in front of a camera, but that, within the next 48 hours, would be seen by every major news outlet in the country. Ethan Mercer drove home to an empty house, sat at his kitchen table, and started writing his full incident report. On the windowsill in Lily's room, the paper airplanes stood in their row, catching the morning light. The calls didn't stop. Ethan had been sitting at his kitchen table for 20 minutes, incident report half-drafted on his laptop, when his phone started ringing in a pattern that told him something had already shifted in the outside world without him. Not one call at a time, clusters of them, back to back, 3 or 4 in a row before he could even look at the screen. He let most of them go to voicemail. The FAA regional director he answered. The Continental Vantage COO's office he did not. The FAA call was brief. A woman named Sandra Okafor, regional director out of the Midwest office, professional and measured in the way federal officials are when they're being careful. She told him she'd received his filed report, that it was being reviewed, that an inspector would be dispatched to Harlow International within the hour, and that he should not delete, alter, or transfer any documentation related to the incident. He told her he understood. She asked him to remain reachable. He said he would. When he hung up, he sat for a moment looking at the half-finished report on the screen. He'd been writing it the way he wrote all his reports, methodically, without editorializing, just the sequence of what he found, and when, and what it meant against the regulatory standard. The fracture dimensions, the location, the load calculations, the part number cross-reference, the shift log inconsistencies laid out side by side with the maintenance signatures. He'd done this kind of documentation for 11 years, and he knew how to make it airtight. He knew which details investigators needed first and which ones could wait. What he hadn't accounted for was his own name being in the news before he'd finished writing it. He opened his laptop browser. The clip was everywhere. Someone had filmed it on a phone from near the windows, slightly shaky, the angle not perfect but clear enough. Victoria Langford in her charcoal blazer pointing, the word Neil audible even through the ambient airport noise. And then Ethan standing there with the coffee cup, saying no with a quietness that somehow read louder than her entire speech. The clip was 43 seconds long and had been compressed and shared so many times in the 3 hours since it happened that several versions were already circulating with captions in different languages. The comments were running about 10-1 in his favor, which didn't make him feel much better about anything. His neighbor, Mrs. Harrington, knocked on the door at 11:30 to ask if he was all right, because she'd seen something on the television and thought it might be him. He told her it was him, and that he was fine. She gave him a look that said she didn't entirely believe the second part, and went back across the street. He thought about calling Lily's school again, just to check in, not to say anything. He didn't. He made himself a sandwich he didn't eat and went back to the report. At Harlow International, the situation had not improved. It had, in fact, become the kind of operational crisis that airline executives have nightmares about. Not the clean, dramatic kind where one thing goes wrong and you fix it, but the cascading kind where one pressure point triggers a system failure that reveals how many other pressure points you never knew existed. The certification authority Ethan held under his contract with Continental Vantage was not simply about Flight 881. That had been the misunderstanding. The one that Victoria's legal team was now, 3 hours too late, scrambling to explain to her in terms she could act on. Ethan's delegated certification authority covered a rolling queue of aircraft that were cycling through Harlow's maintenance operation on any given day. Flight 881 had been the one he'd flagged, but there were 7 other aircraft at Harlow that morning in various stages of ground readiness, all of them pending sign-off in a process that routed through his certification chain. When he resigned and withdrew his authority, those certifications didn't automatically transfer. They lapsed. And under the specific structure of Continental Vantage's operating agreement with the FAA, a structure that, it turned out, had never been fully stress-tested. No aircraft in that queue could be approved for departure by anyone else without a formal reinstatement process that required FAA review. The first departure cancellation hit the boards at 9:58, 43 minutes after Ethan left the building. By 10:30, there were 4. By noon, the number was 11, covering departures from Harlow that fed connections across 6 major hubs. Gate agents who had been managing one frustrated crowd of passengers were now managing 3. The baggage system had been paused pending clarification on which flights were going and which weren't, which meant hundreds of checked bags were sitting in a sorting loop below the terminal going nowhere. The airline's customer service phone lines had wait times climbing past 90 minutes. The media, which had already been at the gate for Flight 881, hadn't left. They'd spread out. By 12:15, there were live trucks in the drop-off lane outside Terminal C, and the story had shifted from CEO humiliates inspector to airline grounds dozens of flights after safety standoff, which was a different story with different implications. And the people inside Continental Vantage's executive suite knew it. Damien Cross had been COO of Continental Vantage for 6 years. He was 53, built like a man who'd played football in college, and kept the posture without keeping up with the exercise, with a face that defaulted to a kind of aggressive confidence that some people read as competence. He'd come up through the operations side of the airline industry, which meant he understood schedules and logistics and the financial mathematics of delay better than almost anyone in the building. He also understood, with a clarity that was currently making his stomach feel like cold concrete, that the situation at Harlow was not containable in the way it needed to be contained. He was in the main conference room on the 38th floor, phones going on 2 separate lines, a tablet open to the live news coverage, a legal pad in front of him with a list of names he needed to call in the next 20 minutes. His deputy, a younger man named Calvin Reese, was at the other end of the table fielding calls from hub operations managers who wanted answers Damien didn't have yet. Victoria walked in at 12:30. She'd been on her phone in her office since she got back from the airport, and the expression she was wearing now was the one she got when she'd moved past the initial shock of a problem and into the cold, focused anger of someone trying to calculate how to survive it. She sat down across from Damien and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Walk me through it," she said. "The certification structure. All of it." Damien leaned forward. The short version is that Mercer's delegated authority was set up as a single-point certification chain for our Harlow maintenance operations. Legal put it together when we brought him on because it was efficient. One certified authority for the whole queue rather than managing multiple sign-off chains. Nobody flagged the dependency risk. Nobody flagged the dependency risk, Victoria repeated. It was a cost structure decision. It made sense at the time. Damien, 11 flights are down. We have passengers in 3 terminals. CNN is running this live. She didn't raise her voice. She almost never did. What does legal say about timeline to restore certification? Minimum 48 hours to get an FAA-approved replacement authority in place. Possibly 72 if the regional office decides to review our entire operating queue given the... He paused. Given the report Mercer filed this morning. Victoria was quiet. How bad is the report? Damien picked up a pen and set it back down. I haven't read it in full. What I've been told is that he documented the landing gear issue, which is... Look, I'm not going to tell you the fracture isn't there because it is, and the inspectors they sent this morning confirmed it. That part of his report is solid. And the rest? The maintenance record documentation. Damien's voice flattened slightly. There are some inconsistencies in the paperwork going back to January. Some of it has to do with how sign-offs were processed during a period when we were running understaffed in the maintenance bay. The scheduling system. Stop. Victoria looked at him. Are the inconsistencies what Mercer says they are? Falsified records? Unauthorized parts? Damien held her gaze for a beat too long. I think the situation is more nuanced than how he's characterized it. That's not an answer. There were shortcuts taken during the Q4 staffing crunch. Some of the documentation processes were compressed in ways that... Who approved the shortcuts? He didn't say anything. Victoria leaned forward. Damien, I need to know right now before the FAA sits down with us. Who approved the maintenance shortcuts? It was a judgment call at the operational level, he said. I was briefed on the staffing pressures. I may have authorized some flexibility in the documentation turnaround protocols. I didn't know about... He stopped himself. I wasn't aware the part sourcing had changed. But you knew the records were being compressed. He looked at the table. Victoria sat back. She looked at Calvin Reese, who had stopped writing and was staring at his legal pad with the concentration of a man who very much wanted to not be in this room. She looked at the live news coverage on the tablet, where a reporter was standing in front of the flight status board at Harlow with the hold, certification review banner behind her, and the chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Continental Vantage. Inspector claims safety records falsified. Airline dismisses concerns. Get me outside counsel, she said to Calvin. Not the in-house team. Outside. And tell communications to prepare a statement that says absolutely nothing until I've spoken to legal. Calvin nodded and left the room. Victoria looked at Damien. You need to get ahead of this. I'm working on it, he said. Get ahead of it publicly. I need a face on camera saying that we take safety seriously, that we're cooperating fully with the FAA, and that this situation is the result of one rogue inspector overstepping his authority. Damien straightened. I can do that. Make sure you're clean when you do, she said. Because if the FAA finds what Mercer says they'll find, I'm not in a position to protect you. She said it without warmth, which was the most honest thing she'd said to him in months. The press conference happened at 2 o'clock in the Continental Vantage executive lobby, under the glass atrium with the airline's logo on the wall behind him. Damien Cross stood at the podium in a dark suit and spoke for 12 minutes with the controlled confidence of someone who has done this before and knows the camera requires stillness. He said the airline was cooperating fully with the FAA review. He said passenger safety was the company's highest priority. He used the phrase uncompromising commitment twice, and that the operational disruptions at Harlow were being resolved as quickly as possible. He said the airline believed the grounded aircraft would receive appropriate clearance once the review process was complete. And then he said this. This situation arose from a single consultant who, for reasons I won't speculate on, chose to take a personal grievance public in a way that was disruptive to our passengers and harmful to our operations. We believe the safety concerns he raised will be found to be within normal operational parameters. We also believe his conduct this morning, including his decision to make his resignation a public spectacle at the expense of 218 passengers, reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of his role. 3 reporters asked follow-up questions. Damien deflected all 3 with variants of, "We're cooperating with the review, and I'm not going to get into specifics while the process is ongoing. It was a competent performance. It looked solid in the moment. It lasted about 4 hours." The thing about Ethan Mercer that Continental Vantage's communications team did not fully appreciate until it was too late was that he was not, in the industry, an unknown quantity. He was not a YouTube personality or a social media presence, or someone whose profile had been built by the clip. He was something more durable, and in the current situation, more dangerous. He was respected. Quietly, without fanfare, in the specific way that people who've been doing hard technical work for a long time are respected by the people who work alongside them. His 9 years with the FAA had included 2 investigations that contributed to national safety directives. He'd been a contributing author on a technical white paper on landing gear fatigue protocols that was still used in industry training. He'd testified before a Congressional Aviation Subcommittee once, 3 years ago, on maintenance documentation standards. Not as a critic, just as an expert witness, explaining how the systems worked. People in the industry knew his name. By 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, several of them had said so on the record. The first was a former NTSB investigator named Patricia Huang, who told a reporter from the Aviation Safety Monitor that Ethan Mercer was one of the most methodical certification professionals I've encountered in 30 years, and that his willingness to ground an aircraft was not the behavior of someone with a personal grievance. It's the behavior of someone who found something real. The interview was published online at 3:12 and had been shared 6,000 times by 4 o'clock. The second was a professor from a major aeronautical engineering program who appeared on a cable news segment at 3:45 and explained, with the patient clarity of someone used to talking to non-specialists, exactly what a portside landing gear fracture meant under transatlantic flight stress loads. He used the word catastrophic twice and was asked to clarify both times and said yes. He meant it literally, both times. The third was Tom Bryce, Ethan's former FAA supervisor, who didn't give a formal interview but posted a statement on a professional aviation forum that was brief and specific. I worked with Ethan Mercer for 9 years. He does not make mistakes on structural defects. If he flagged it, it was real. The post was shared 2,000 times before dinner. Damien Cross, watching the coverage from his office, called his communications director and said 4 words, "Contain this by tonight." His communications director said he'd try. The communications director was a pragmatic woman named Jenna Park, who had been in crisis PR for 16 years, and she knew, even as she said she'd try, that you cannot outmessage a structural defect confirmed by federal inspectors. You can spin process. You can reframe intent. You can manage optics around judgment calls and gray areas. You cannot make a cracked landing gear not exist after investigators have photographed it. The math doesn't work. She called her contact at the FAA regional office, not for comment, just to read the temperature. The FAA contact was not available. His assistant said he was in a meeting that had been going since 1:30. Jenna Park put the phone down and started drafting a revised statement for the morning. The FAA inspection team had arrived at Hangar 7 at 11:20 that morning, 4 inspectors with equipment and authorization, and they'd been working through the afternoon in the quiet, serious way federal aviation inspectors work, when they know the press is outside and the results will matter. They didn't rush. They didn't take shortcuts. They went through every component of the portside landing gear assembly, and then, because the documentation issues Ethan had flagged opened a broader question, they began pulling records going back 6 months. Gerald Pham, the maintenance supervisor who'd taken Ethan's call that morning, was cooperative in the way a man is cooperative when he knows that being uncooperative will be worse. He answered every question. He pulled every record they asked for. And when the lead inspector, a man named Robert Castillo, asked him about the January component replacement and the part number that didn't match the certified supplier chain, Gerald went quiet for a moment and then said, "I was told it was approved." "Told by who?" Castillo asked. Gerald looked at the floor. "My understanding was it came down from operations." "From who specifically in operations?" Gerald picked up a pen and set it down. "I'd have to check the email chain," he said. Castillo said that would be fine. He'd wait. The email chain, when Gerald pulled it up, showed a directive from a deputy operations manager referencing authorization from the COO's office for an expedited sourcing arrangement during Q4. The email was careful. Nothing in it said use uncertified parts, because nobody writes that in an email. But the part number referenced, and the vendor approved, and the timeline compressed added up to exactly what Ethan's report said it did. Castillo photographed the screen. Then he went outside and called his regional director, Shab. Ethan finished his report at 4:15 and submitted it formally to the FAA portal. It was 31 pages, including the photographic documentation, which was more than his standard reports by about 10 pages. But the situation was not standard, and he wanted nothing left out. He was making coffee, real coffee, not the airport cup he'd never drunk, when his phone rang and the screen said, "Lily, school." He answered immediately. "Hello? Mr. Mercer?" The voice was the school secretary, Carol, who he'd spoken to enough times over the years that he recognized her without needing the introduction. "Lily's fine. I just want you to know that. But we've had a couple of reporters call the school asking about me." "Yes, sir. We didn't tell them anything, and we won't. But I thought you should know." "Thank you, Carol." He exhaled. "I'll come pick her up early. Is that all right?" "Of course, she can wait in the office." He put his jacket back on and grabbed his keys. On the way to the car, he checked his voicemail. 14 messages. One of them was from a number he didn't recognize, a New York area code, and the message was from a producer at a major national morning news program asking if he'd be willing to do an interview. He deleted it. One message was from a retired colleague named Frank Daly, who'd worked maintenance certification at a different carrier for 20 years. Frank's message was 3 sentences. "Heard about what you did, saw what they said about you on the news. You did the right thing, and they know it." Ethan listened to that one twice. Then he drove to get Lily. She came out of the school office with her backpack and her lunchbox, and that slightly wary look she got when the adults around her were acting like something was happening but not telling her what. She was 9, which meant she understood more than people gave her credit for, and slightly less than she thought she did. "Why are you picking me up early?" she asked, climbing into the back seat. "Just thought we'd have more time together," he said. She looked at him. "You seem weird." "I had a long morning." "Did something happen at work?" He started the car. "Sort of, yeah." "Did you get in trouble?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was watching him with those dark eyes that always made him feel like she was evaluating him against some internal standard. "No," he said. "I didn't get in trouble. The right thing and the easy thing were different today, and I picked the right thing. She thought about that for a moment. That's what you always tell me to do. Yeah, he said. I know. So what happens now? He pulled out of the school lot and onto the street. The sky had cleared since morning. The afternoon light was going flat and gold. He didn't have a clean answer for her, and he wasn't going to pretend he did. I'm not sure yet, he said honestly. She accepted that. She looked out the window at the passing street. After a minute, she said, Can we make paper airplanes tonight? He felt something loosen in his chest. Yeah, he said. We can do that. She nodded, satisfied, and pulled out a book from her backpack. She read for the rest of the drive with the easy confidence of a child who'd just settled the most important question of the afternoon. By 6 o'clock that evening, the story had moved past the CEO humiliates worker frame and into something that the networks were calling, with varying degrees of accuracy, an aviation safety crisis. The number of grounded flights had stabilized at 14, not because the problem had been resolved, but because the FAA had clarified which aircraft in Continental Vantage's Harlow queue were affected and which had separate certification channels. Passengers were being rebooked. Hotels near the airport were filling up. The airline's rebooking app had crashed twice. A senior aviation correspondent for one of the major networks did a 7-minute segment at 6:30 that explained, in the kind of slow, careful television language that reaches people who aren't following the aviation trade press, what a landing gear fracture means and what falsified maintenance records mean, and why those two things together, on an aircraft carrying 218 people across the Atlantic, were not a paperwork dispute. She ended the segment by putting Damian Cross's press conference quote on the screen, a fundamental misunderstanding of his role, and letting it sit there for a few seconds without comment. The silence was more effective than anything she could have said. Damian Cross, watching in his office, called his personal attorney at 6:32. He said he needed to talk. His attorney said, Come in tomorrow morning. Damian said he needed to talk tonight. His attorney said to come in at 8. Victoria Langford did not watch the 6 o'clock news. She was in a call with her board chair, a man named Henry Aldrich, who was 70 years old, who had been chair through 2 recessions and one major safety incident 12 years ago that had nearly ended the airline, and who spoke in the deliberate, unhurried way of someone who has learned that panic accomplishes nothing. He listened to her summary of the day for 4 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, What does our legal exposure look like on the maintenance records? Outside counsel is reviewing tonight, she said. Is Damian exposed? She paused. Potentially. Is the airline exposed? The authorization chain goes through operations. How far up it reaches? She stopped. We're still mapping it. Victoria. His voice was calm. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need a straight answer. Not a careful answer. A straight one. All right. Was Mercer right? She was quiet for 3 seconds. About the landing gear, yes, she said. The inspectors confirmed it this afternoon. About the records, we're still establishing the full scope. But substantially, another beat. Substantially, yes. Henry Aldrich made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. Then you have a problem that's bigger than the news cycle, he said. And you know what it is? She did. She'd known it since she'd watched Ethan walk away across the concourse with the cameras tracking him, and something in the stillness of how he moved had told her, in a way her legal team's framing hadn't, that she'd gotten this badly wrong. I'll call you tomorrow morning, she said. Before the markets open, he said. Not after. She put the phone down and sat in her office for a while as the city went dark outside the windows. The lights were coming on across the skyline. She was thinking about Damian and what he'd told her and what he hadn't. She was thinking about a landing gear fracture on a plane carrying 218 people. She was thinking about a man who'd stood in a public concourse and refused to kneel and then just walked away, and what it meant that she'd been the one who asked. She picked up her phone and looked up Ethan Mercer's contact information. She held the phone in her hand for a moment, then she put it down. Not tonight. There was too much she didn't know yet, too much she needed to know before she said anything to him that she meant. But she would call. She already understood that much. The paper airplanes they'd made that Tuesday night were still on Lily's windowsill when the story broke open on Wednesday morning. Ethan had stayed up until almost midnight, finishing the supplemental documentation the FAA had requested. Additional cross-references on the part sourcing chain, a timeline of the maintenance entries against the shift logs, a written summary of his inspection methodology for the landing gear assessment. He'd sent the last file at 11:47, made himself eat half a bowl of cereal standing at the kitchen counter, and gone to bed without checking the news again. He'd learned a long time ago that reading about yourself on the internet late at night was a reliable way to feel worse about everything without gaining any useful information. He slept badly anyway. Lily was up at 5 with the inhaler and then back to sleep, and then up again at 6:45 for school with the specific morning energy of a 9-year-old who'd rested well and wanted to talk about cloud formation before he'd had coffee. He listened. He answered. He drove her to school on the same route they always took, past the gas station and the park, with the broken swing that the city had been promising to fix for 2 years. And he didn't tell her that when he'd glanced at his phone while she was brushing her teeth, he'd counted 47 missed calls and 3 voicemails from numbers with Washington, D.C. area codes. He dropped her off. She waved from the door without looking back, already talking to a friend, already somewhere else. He sat in the pickup line for a moment after the other cars had moved, just breathing. Then he drove to meet the FAA. The regional office had requested his presence at 9 o'clock for what they called a formal interview session, which was the bureaucratic language for a recorded conversation with 2 senior inspectors and a legal representative present. The meeting was at a federal building 40 minutes from Harlow, in a conference room on the 4th floor that had the specific institutional quality of a space designed to feel neither welcoming nor hostile. Beige walls, a rectangular table, a whiteboard with nothing on it, a water pitcher in the middle that no one ever touched. Robert Castillo was there, the lead inspector from the hangar the day before. He was a compact man in his early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a legal pad already half covered in notes. Beside him was a woman named Anne Fielding, senior investigator, who had the patient, watchful quality of someone who spent most of her professional life listening for the thing people weren't saying. The FAA legal representative was a younger man named Marcus Webb, who sat slightly to the side and said almost nothing for 2 hours. Ethan walked them through everything from the beginning, the preliminary record review the night before, the call to Gerald Pham, the physical inspection, the fracture, the documentation cross-references. He spoke without notes because he'd written the report twice and knew it the way he knew his own handwriting. Castillo asked questions that were specific and technical and occasionally circular, not trying to trap him, just making sure the account held from every angle. It held. When Ethan finished, Castillo looked at his legal pad for a moment and then took his glasses off his forehead and put them on and looked at Ethan over the rims. "I want to be straight with you about where we are," Castillo said. "The fracture is confirmed. Our team's assessment matches yours on location, characteristics, and risk profile. Under transatlantic stress loads and a standard Frankfurt landing, we're looking at a probable failure event. Probable, not certain, but the probability is high enough that we don't use words like possible when we write it up internally." Ethan nodded. "The documentation is the part that's going to take longer," Castillo continued. "We've got the email chain from Gerald Pham's records. We've got the part sourcing discrepancy. We've got 3 inspection sign-offs from technicians who weren't on shift. What we don't have yet, what we need, is testimony from someone inside the operation who can speak to how those decisions were authorized. The paper trail goes up to a certain point and then gets," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "indirect." "You need someone who was in the room," Ethan said, "or in the email chain above where it currently stops." Anne Fielding, who had been quiet for most of the morning, leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I want to ask you something outside the formal record for a moment." She glanced at Marcus Webb, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "In your time working with Continental Vantage's maintenance operation, your general impressions, not specific incidents, did the documentation pressure feel systemic or like isolated decisions?" Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. "I wasn't embedded in their operation," he said. "I reviewed the output, not the process, but—" He stopped. "There were things that moved fast, faster than they should have. I flagged 2 minor documentation issues in the 6 months I was there. Both times I was told they'd been corrected. I didn't follow up far enough on either one." "Why not?" He looked at the table. "Because the corrections they showed me looked complete, and because I was trying to do my job without making enemies of everyone I worked with, and that's a balance that's harder than it sounds." He paused. "I should have pushed harder on the second one. The part sourcing timeline didn't add up, and I let it go because the documentation they provided was technically sufficient. I've been sitting with that since yesterday morning. Fielding wrote something down. For the record, Mr. Mercer, nothing in our review suggests you missed anything you were required to catch under your contract scope. What you found yesterday morning, you found. That's what matters to us. He appreciated that she said it. It didn't entirely fix the thing he was sitting with, but he appreciated it. I was out of the FAA office by 11:30 and back in his truck with his phone blowing up again in the cup holder. He scrolled through the notifications quickly enough to get a shape of the situation without reading anything in full. The story had moved. There were multiple outlets now running with details from the FAA inspection, details he hadn't given anyone, which meant either someone inside the regional office had talked, or Continental Vantage's own people were leaking, or both. The phrase falsified maintenance records was in 3 separate headlines. So was Damian Cross's name, attached to a report from a political journalist who covered federal investigations and had apparently started making calls the previous evening. There was also a piece on a long-form news site that someone had forwarded to him via text. His old college roommate, of all people, who he hadn't spoken to in 8 months, headlined, "Who is Ethan Mercer?" The safety inspector who wouldn't kneel. He didn't read it. He wasn't ready to read someone else's version of his own life. He called Tom Bryce instead. Tom answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "How'd it go?" "Fine," Ethan said. "They're serious. Castillo knows what he's doing." "I know Castillo. He's solid. What are they saying about timeline?" "They want the testimony piece closed before they go public with findings. Someone inside the maintenance chain needs to give them the authorization path above Gerald's level." Tom made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "And nobody's talking yet?" "Not as of this morning." "Someone will," Tom said. Situations like this, when the federal investigation is already running and the press is already there, someone always talks. The question is whether they talk on their terms or after they've been cornered. Ethan stared through the windshield at the parking structure wall. "I keep thinking about the mechanic who did the actual replacement work in January," he said. "Whoever signed off on installing that component knew what they were installing. They had the part number in front of them. They had the supplier documentation. They either flagged it and got overruled, or they didn't flag it and knew why." "Yeah," Tom said. "That person is probably having a very rough week. I don't want them prosecuted for doing what they were told to do." "That's not your call." "I know," Ethan said. "I know it's not." He drove home and made a real lunch for the first time in 2 days and sat at the kitchen table and ate it without doing anything else. Just ate. The house was very quiet at midday. He could hear the refrigerator and a car going past outside and nothing else. He thought about the fracture, the way it had looked in the beam of his flashlight. A thin, dark line running against the grain of the housing, so precise it could almost have been a drawn mark. He'd taken the first photograph and then crouched there for a moment without moving, just looking at it, doing the math in his head about what it meant. He did that with every significant find. Let the reality of it settle before the protocol kicked in. Because once the protocol kicked in, it became a report, a process, a chain of action. And for a few seconds before that, it was just a fact, sitting in front of him with all its weight. A cracked landing gear. A falsified record. 218 people who'd checked in that morning, expecting to eat bad airplane food over the Atlantic and land in Frankfurt for meetings or vacations or to see family they hadn't seen in too long. He'd sat with that for about 30 seconds in the hangar. Then he'd stood up and started photographing. He didn't think he'd made a hard choice. He thought he'd made the only choice available to someone who understood what they were looking at. But he understood now, sitting in his quiet kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, that not everyone would have done what he did. That some people would have looked at the fracture and looked at the morning schedule and looked at the career math and decided that the documentation question could be handled separately after the flight departed, quietly, through channels. He'd known people in the industry who would have done exactly that. He didn't think they were bad people. He thought they were people who'd made a different calculation, and he thought the distance between his calculation and theirs was probably not as wide as it felt from his side. That was the part that stuck with him. The mechanic's name was Dennis Farrow. He was 41 years old, third-generation aviation maintenance, had worked for Continental Vantage for 8 years after a decade at a regional carrier in the Southeast. He had 2 kids, a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and a mortgage on a house in a suburb 40 minutes from Harlow that he'd bought 3 years ago when the promotion to senior technician came through. He was not the kind of man who appeared in news stories. He was the kind of man who showed up at 5:30 in the morning, did his work, went home, coached his son's soccer team on Saturdays, and didn't think about himself as someone with a role in large events. He'd thought about quitting in January. When the directive came down about the sourcing arrangement and the compressed timeline and the sign-offs that needed to happen before the end of the quarter, he'd stood in the maintenance bay looking at a part number that didn't match the approved supplier chain and asked his shift supervisor what they were supposed to do about that. And his shift supervisor, a man named Ray, who'd been doing this longer than Dennis and who looked tired in a way that had become permanent, had said the authorization had come down from operations and it was handled. Dennis had looked at the part number for another moment. Then he'd installed the component. He'd told himself it was probably fine, that the part was probably equivalent, that the authorization chain above him probably knew something he didn't about the sourcing arrangement. He told himself a lot of things in January, standing in the hangar at 6 in the morning with a quota to meet and a shift supervisor telling him it was authorized, and most of those things had temporarily worked. They stopped working Tuesday morning when he watched the news from his truck in the employee parking lot and saw Ethan Mercer's name and saw the words portside landing gear and understood immediately what aircraft they were talking about. He'd sat in his truck for 40 minutes. He'd been late to his shift. He'd made it through the day by not thinking about it directly, the way you can sometimes not look directly at a bright light. By Wednesday morning, the FAA inspectors had been in the building for 20 hours and had already spoken to Gerald Pham and 2 other technicians. Dennis knew they were working the chain. He knew it was only a matter of time. He called his wife at 9 in the morning and told her he needed to talk to someone. She said she'd call her cousin who was a paralegal. He said that wasn't quite what he needed. She said, "What do you need?" He said he didn't know exactly, but that he'd done something in January that he'd been telling himself was okay, and it wasn't, and he needed to figure out what to do about it. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Did someone get hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, "but they could have." Another silence. "Then you know what you need to do," she said. He did. He'd known since Tuesday morning in the parking lot. He just hadn't been ready to say it out loud until now. He asked to speak to the FAA investigators at 10:30 that morning. Robert Castillo and Ann Fielding sat across from Dennis Farrow in a small room off the main maintenance office, a space normally used for shift briefings, with a folding table and 4 chairs and a recording device that Castillo placed in the center of the table and identified for the record before they began. Dennis had declined to wait for a lawyer, which Castillo noted and did not push on. He'd seen this before. People who needed to say the thing more than they needed to be protected from the consequences of saying it. Those were usually the ones who told you everything. Dennis told them everything. He walked through the January timeline from the beginning, the directive that had come down, the part number discrepancy, the conversation with Ray, the authorization he'd been told was in place. He explained how the documentation had worked, the sign-offs that were processed after the fact, the way the inspection records were logged as complete before the physical inspections had occurred, because the operations directive had set a timeline that the documentation process couldn't physically meet, and the solution chosen was to reverse the sequence. Do the work, log the inspection, sign off a date that predated the actual completion. "Was that standard practice?" Fielding asked. Dennis shook his head. "No, I'd never seen it done before. I've seen paperwork run a few hours late, maybe a day. Not backdated like this. Not deliberately." "Who gave the specific instruction to backdate the records?" Dennis looked at the recorder. "Ray told me it had come from the operations directive. I didn't see a written instruction to backdate. Nobody put that in writing. But the timeline we were given made the normal sequence impossible, and everyone knew it, and nobody from above the shift level said anything about it." "Did you raise a concern?" I asked Ray about the part number. "Verbally." "Yes." "Not in writing." Dennis shook his head again. He looked like a man who understood exactly how that sounded and had been understanding it painfully for about 36 hours. "I asked him verbally, and he said it was authorized from operations. I didn't ask anything else." "Did you believe him?" He was quiet for a moment. "I believed it was possible," he said. I didn't ask the next question. I should have asked who specifically authorized it, and I should have gotten it in writing. I know that. I knew it in January, and I didn't do it. Fielding wrote something down. Mr. Farrow, did anyone explicitly tell you the part was equivalent to the certified supplier component? Ray said the sourcing arrangement was approved. That was all. Do you know if it was functionally equivalent? Dennis looked at the table. I installed it, he said. I looked at it. I've been working on landing gear for 15 years. It looked right. But I knew the supplier wasn't on the approved list, and I installed it anyway because I was told it was authorized. He paused. I've been thinking about that landing gear for 2 days. Castillo leaned forward slightly. The directive that came down, the timeline and the sourcing arrangement, do you know who originated it above the operations level? Dennis took a breath. Ray said it came from the COO's office. I heard his name, Cross, in the context of the Q4 push. I didn't see documentation of that, but it was common knowledge on the floor that the Q4 timeline pressure was coming from above operations management. Castillo and Fielding exchanged a glance that was brief and professional and communicated something neither of them said out loud. Mr. Farrow, Castillo said, I want to be clear with you about something. Your cooperation here is noted. The question of individual accountability for the technician level versus the authorization chain above is a determination that will be made through the formal investigation process, and if it proceeds to that point, by prosecutors. I'm not in a position to make you any guarantees. What I can tell you is that your decision to come forward voluntarily and provide this account matters to how this is understood. Dennis nodded. He looked like a man who'd put down something very heavy and wasn't sure yet if he felt better or worse for having done it. Probably both. Is there anything else? Castillo asked. Dennis thought for a moment. The inspector, he said. Mercer. I saw the news, what they said about him, that he was making a personal grievance public. He shook his head slowly. He found what was there. I installed that component. I know what he found, because I know what I installed. He wasn't making anything up. Fielding looked at him. For the record, Mr. Farrow, the physical inspection fully corroborates Mr. Mercer's report. Dennis nodded again. He looked out the small window at the tarmac, at the planes that had been sitting since yesterday, cold and still under the gray March sky. Those people on that flight, he said. It wasn't a full sentence. He didn't finish it, and neither of them asked him to. The formal findings briefing happened that afternoon at 4 o'clock, in the same fourth-floor federal conference room where Ethan had been interviewed that morning. Castillo and Fielding and Marcus Webb were joined by 2 officials from the FAA's Washington office who had driven up overnight and were present in the specific way that senior officials are present when a situation has moved past the regional level. Victoria Langford was there with her outside counsel. Damian Cross was not. He was with his personal attorney, which told its own story. Castillo presented the findings in order, without editorializing, in the flat and precise language of federal aviation investigation that nonetheless carried its weight clearly. The fracture, confirmed, with a technical assessment of risk under operational stress loads. The documentation discrepancies, inspection records signed by technicians not present, dates predating completion, approvals logged for inspections that hadn't occurred. The component discrepancy, a landing gear part from a non-certified supplier installed under a sourcing arrangement that did not meet Continental Vantage's operating certificate requirements. The authorization chain, documented to the COO's office level through email records and corroborated by technician testimony. He laid it out for 22 minutes without stopping. The room was very quiet. When he finished, one of the Washington officials, a woman named Dr. Ruth Halverson, who ran the FAA's Aviation Safety Compliance Division, spoke for the first time. She had white hair and reading glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this work for 3 decades and had stopped being surprised by anything. Ms. Longford, she said, I want to be direct with you about what this means going forward. The findings we've presented today form the basis for formal enforcement action against Continental Vantage's operating certificate. The specific scope of that action will depend on what your organization provides to us voluntarily in the next 48 hours. But I want you to understand clearly that the question of whether enforcement proceeds is not in doubt. The question is what shape it takes. Victoria's outside counsel, a man named Paul Stringer, who had handled aviation regulatory matters for 30 years, leaned forward to respond. Victoria put her hand on his arm, briefly, just to stop him. I understand, she said. She was looking at Halverson, not at Stringer. What do you need from us? Halverson listed 4 things: a complete audit of all maintenance records going back 18 months across Continental Vantage's Harlow operation, full access to the authorization chain documentation above the operations management level, a voluntary grounding of all aircraft in the affected maintenance queue pending independent certification review, and a written acknowledgement of the findings submitted to the FAA within 24 hours. The acknowledgement isn't an admission of liability, Halverson said. It's an acknowledgement that the findings are factually accurate. Your legal team will understand the distinction. Victoria looked at Stringer, who nodded once, cautiously. We'll have it to you by tomorrow morning, Victoria said. What she didn't say in the room, but what she was calculating even as she spoke, was the distance between this moment and the one in Terminal C yesterday morning when she'd stood in front of 218 passengers and a row of cameras and told Ethan Mercer that his judgment was in error. That distance was now measurable and on the record and would be for a very long time. She had known since last night that she'd been wrong. She was only now beginning to understand how specifically and how completely. The press statement from the FAA's regional office went out at 5:45 Wednesday evening. It was careful in the way federal statements are careful. It confirmed an active investigation, confirmed the physical findings, and stated that the agency had received full cooperation from a consultant whose safety report had initiated the review. It did not use Ethan's name. It didn't need to. Every journalist covering the story already knew it, and the networks were running his name and photograph alongside the FAA statement within minutes of the release. Ethan was at the kitchen table helping Lily with her homework, a worksheet on long division that she found genuinely offensive, when his phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bryce. FAA statement is out. You should read it. He set the phone face down and went back to the long division. Lily was working through a problem with the focused irritation of someone who understood the concept perfectly well and resented having to show the steps. You don't have to show the steps? He offered. You do, she said. Mrs. Aldrin says if you don't show the steps, she doesn't know you actually understand it. Mrs. Aldrin's right, he said. Lily looked at him sideways. You always agree with the teacher. Teachers are usually right about the things they're right about. She wrote something down with more force than was strictly necessary. What about when they're wrong? Then you still show the steps, he said. Politely. She considered this. Then she went back to the worksheet. He watched her work and didn't pick up his phone. The FAA statement could wait. The news coverage could wait. His daughter's long division could not. At 6:30, while Lily ate dinner and watched 20 minutes of television that he permitted on school nights without guilt, Ethan sat in the hallway outside her room and finally read through the coverage. The FAA statement. The follow-up pieces on the maintenance findings. A short piece from the Aviation Safety Monitor that included a quote from Patricia Huang calling the confirmation of Ethan's report exactly what the independent certification system is designed to produce. A longer piece from a national outlet that had obtained, through sources it didn't name, some of the substance of Dennis Farrow's testimony, not the specific quotes, but the shape of it, the authorization chain leading upward. And then he found the Continental Vantage statement, posted at 6:15. It was 3 paragraphs. The first said the airline acknowledged the FAA's findings and was cooperating fully with the investigation. The second said Continental Vantage was committed to the highest safety standards and was conducting an internal review. The third was the one he read twice. It said, Continental Vantage regrets that the concerns raised by Mr. Ethan Mercer were not addressed through appropriate internal channels and acknowledges that his assessment of the aircraft in question was accurate. The airline is in the process of reviewing all aspects of its maintenance documentation protocols. He read it a third time. It was not an apology. It was a legal statement constructed to acknowledge enough of the truth to demonstrate cooperation without admitting to a degree of fault that would complicate the litigation that was certainly coming. He understood that. He'd been around corporate communications long enough to read it for what it was. But somewhere inside the careful language was a fact that mattered to him, not as a legal point, but as a simple human truth. They'd said he was right. On the record. In a statement with the Continental Vantage logo on it. He thought about standing in that concourse. The camera. Victoria Langford's voice carrying across the gate area, the coffee cup in his hand. The 218 passengers in the background who didn't know yet that the man she was asking to kneel was the same man who'd spent 40 minutes on his knees that morning looking at the underside of their airplane. He put the phone down and went back into the living room to watch the last few minutes of television with his daughter because she leaned against him when they watched TV in the evenings, and that was something he didn't take for granted. Damian Cross and his attorney met with the FAA's legal team and a federal prosecutor for the first time at 8 o'clock Wednesday evening. The prosecutor's involvement had been quiet, not yet announced, but the email chain and Dennis Farrow's testimony and the parts documentation together had crossed a threshold that moved the matter from regulatory enforcement to something more serious. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Damian's attorney did most of the talking. Damian sat in the chair next to him and listened and occasionally answered questions in the short, controlled way of a man who understood that every word was now a permanent record. At one point, the prosecutor, a younger man named Kevin Shore, who had an unremarkable face and a very precise way of framing questions, asked Damian directly, "Were you aware in the fourth quarter of last year that maintenance documentation was being backdated to meet the operational timeline you'd authorized?" Damian's attorney started to respond. Damian held up a hand just slightly, and his attorney stopped. Damian looked at Kevin Shore. He'd been in business for 30 years. He'd made decisions at every level of a major airline's operations, and had always told himself that the difference between himself and people who got into legal trouble was judgment, knowing where the lines were and staying behind them. He told himself that about the Q4 directive too. Compression of timeline, flexibility in process, trust the operators to manage the details. That was how he'd framed it. That was how he'd been framing it since Tuesday morning when the calls started. He sat in that conference room at 8 in the evening, 2 days after a federal inspector had confirmed a cracked landing gear on a plane carrying 218 people, and he thought about how he'd framed it. "I need to speak with my attorney privately," he said. Kevin Shore said that was fine. He'd wait. The conversation Damian had with his attorney in the hallway lasted 11 minutes. When they came back, his attorney spoke for 3 minutes, and what he said amounted to the beginning of a conversation that would continue for several more weeks, but that had, in that moment, changed direction in a way that couldn't be undone. Down the hall, in the lobby of the federal building, Jenna Park, who'd been told to wait because her boss might need her, sat in a chair and looked at her phone and thought about the statement she'd helped Damian deliver on Tuesday afternoon. The one about the rogue inspector, the fundamental misunderstanding of his role. She'd written most of that statement. She'd thought it was defensible at the time. She opened a new document on her phone and started drafting her resignation letter because she'd been in crisis PR long enough to know when a ship was going down and how much faster it went when you stayed on it. Outside the building, the March night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens everything. The parking lot lights were on. Somewhere across the city, planes were taking off from the terminals that were still operational, their lights rising in the dark. And every one of them, for the foreseeable future, would be inspected by someone who knew that the system worked when the person inside it refused to look away from what was actually there. Thursday came in gray and cold, the kind of morning that doesn't bother announcing itself, just arrives and settles over everything like it was always there. Ethan was up before 5. Not because of Lily. She'd slept through the night, her breathing steady, the inhaler untouched on the nightstand where he'd checked it twice. He was up because somewhere around 3 in the morning, his mind had simply decided it was done with sleep and had moved on without him. He lay in the dark for an hour trying to will himself back under. And when that didn't work, he got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and looked at nothing in particular. The house was the kind of quiet that only exists before 6 in the morning. He'd lived alone with Lily for 4 years now, since she was 5. Since the marriage had ended in the specific way that marriages end, when two people have been slowly becoming strangers for long enough that one day they look at each other and both know it. It hadn't been dramatic. There was no single incident, no defining betrayal, just the accumulated weight of two people who'd stopped being able to reach each other across a distance that kept growing. His ex-wife, Karen, lived 40 minutes away and took Lily on alternating weekends and 2 weeks in the summer. They were civil in the way former spouses are civil when they're both trying to do right by their kid and don't quite know how to be around each other anymore. He didn't call her to tell her what had happened at the airport. She'd seen it on the news anyway. She'd texted him Tuesday evening. Just 3 words. Are you okay? He'd texted back, yeah, thanks. They didn't follow up. He drank his coffee and listened to the refrigerator and thought about what came next. The FAA investigation was moving. Damian Cross had lawyered up in a way that suggested he was negotiating with the federal prosecutor's office, which meant the criminal exposure was real, and he knew it. The airline's board had called an emergency session for Thursday morning, according to a text from Tom Bryce at 11 the previous night. Continental Vantage's stock had dropped 4% on Wednesday and was being watched closely for the open. The grounded flights at Harlow were still grounded, pending the independent certification review the FAA had required, and would remain so for at least another 48 hours. And Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table at 5 in the morning, unemployed, with a daughter who needed her school lunch packed and a stack of professional inquiries on his phone that he hadn't answered and wasn't sure how to think about yet. He packed Lily's lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, the crackers she liked, a note that said good luck on the division worksheet because she had a math quiz and had been anxious about it the night before in the specific way she got anxious. Not dramatic, just very quiet and very focused on her hands. He folded the note and put it in the front pocket of her lunchbox where she'd find it. He woke her at 6:45 and made her eggs and listened to her talk about the quiz and did not think about anything else for 35 minutes. He drove her to school. She waved from the door. He sat in the parking lot. His phone rang. The screen said Victoria Langford. He looked at it for 2 full rings. Then he answered. Her voice was different from how it had been in the terminal. Quieter. Not subdued exactly. She wasn't a subdued person, but measured in a different way. Not the precision of someone controlling a situation. The precision of someone choosing their words carefully because they understood the weight of them. Mr. Mercer, she said, I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I want to ask if you'd be willing to meet with me. In person. Without attorneys. What for? He said. Not hostile, just direct. Because what I need to say to you shouldn't be in a legal document, she said, and it shouldn't be on the phone. He sat with that for a moment. Through the windshield, he could see the school's front doors, already closed, the flagpole with the flag moving slightly in the cold morning air. Where? He said. She suggested a hotel restaurant near the airport. Neutral ground. Not her office, not his home. He said fine. She said 10 o'clock. He said he'd be there. When he hung up, he sat in the parking lot for another few minutes. He wasn't nervous exactly. He was something more like cautious. The way you're cautious approaching something you can't fully see yet. He'd learned a long time ago that people who've been powerful for a long time have a particular way of apologizing that isn't quite an apology, that keeps one hand on the ledger even while the other hand extends. He didn't know yet which kind she was. He drove home and changed his shirt and drove to the hotel. She was there before him, which he hadn't expected. She was at a corner table, no communications team, no assistant, just a cup of coffee. She hadn't touched much and a phone she'd turned face down on the table. She was in a dark blazer, not the charcoal one from Tuesday, a different one. And her hair was neat, but there were things around her eyes that a day and a half of bad sleep leaves on a person. He sat down. A server came and he ordered coffee. Neither of them said anything until the server left. Then Victoria looked at him directly, which he appreciated. Some people in her position would have started with the situation, with the investigation, with the legal framework. She didn't. I owe you an apology, she said. Not from the company. From me, personally. What I did in that concourse on Tuesday morning was wrong. Not strategically wrong. Not wrong because it backfired. It was wrong because I treated you the way I've treated a lot of problems in my career, as something to be managed rather than someone to be heard. He waited. He wanted to hear the rest before he said anything. You told me there was a safety issue. You showed documentation. And I decided in about 10 minutes that you were a contractor with a grievance and that the correct response was to make you publicly back down so the morning could proceed on schedule. She paused. I've run this airline for 14 years by reading rooms and reading people and being right more often than I'm wrong. I was wrong about you in a way that I don't have a good excuse for. She picked up her coffee cup, held it, didn't drink. I've been asking myself since Tuesday night what I actually saw when I looked at you in that room with Carla. And the honest answer is that I saw an obstacle. I saw a man in a navy jacket holding up my aircraft, and I made a judgment about who he was and what he wanted, and I acted on that judgment, and I was wrong. Not about whether you'd back down. I was wrong about what was actually happening. Ethan looked at his coffee. He thought about what to say and decided to say what was true. I've been doing this work for 11 years, he said. I flagged things before. Not always this serious, but I've had conversations with operations people, management people, where I said there's a problem, and they said, let's talk about it through channels. I understand the pressure around departure schedules. I understand what a ground stop costs. I wasn't trying to make your morning difficult. I know that now, she said, but I also need to tell you, the way you handled it in public, asking me to kneel. He kept his voice even. That wasn't about the flight. That was about making sure everyone watching understood that you were the one with the authority. I understand why people do that. I don't think it's something you should feel good about. Victoria held his gaze. I don't, she said. I haven't felt good about anything since I walked out of that gate area. There was a silence that wasn't hostile, just honest. There are 218 people who were on the manifest for that flight, Ethan said. I don't know any of them, but I know what the failure analysis on that landing gear looks like under Frankfurt landing stress. And I know that some of those 218 people would have had kids traveling with them, or were going home to someone. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that when I said the aircraft wasn't flying, it wasn't a negotiating position. I understand that, she said quietly. Do you? He wasn't being harsh. He genuinely wanted to know. She set down the coffee cup. I do now, she said. I understood it differently on Tuesday. I'm trying to be honest with you about that. I think I genuinely believed in that moment that the risk had been overstated, that our team's assessment was more reliable than yours because our team was ours, and because you were inconvenient. She shook her head slightly. That's not a defense. It's what I was thinking. I know, he said. I figured. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. What would it have taken? In that room with Carla, before it went public, what would it have taken for you to feel like the concern was being genuinely heard? He thought about it. He gave her the real answer, not the quick one. If Carla or someone she trusted had walked to that hangar with me, right then, and looked at what I found, that would have been it. Not a promise to review it later. Not a reassurance that your team would assess it. Just come look at it. Because once you look at it, the math is obvious. You don't need to take my word for anything if you've seen it yourself. She nodded slowly. If someone had done that, he said, the flight still wouldn't have gone, but the conversation would have been different. Yes, she said, it would have. They sat for a while in that corner booth with the morning light coming through the window, not quite friends, not quite adversaries. Two people on opposite sides of something that had already happened and couldn't be unwound, trying to be honest with each other about it. It wasn't comfortable. Ethan hadn't expected it to be comfortable, but it was real, which was more than he'd expected when she called. When he stood to leave, she stood too. Thank you for coming, she said. He nodded. I appreciate that you called. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, the kind of handshake that's become habitual from years of professional life. But there was something in it that wasn't quite habitual. A slight pause at the end, like she wanted to say something else and decided not to. He let it go. He drove home in the gray morning and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside, just letting the quiet settle around him. The board meeting at Continental Vantage's headquarters started at 9 and ran until almost 1 in the afternoon. Henry Aldrich presided with the unhurried gravity of someone who understood that the decisions made in this room today would be studied for years, not only by the company's own people, but by regulators, by industry observers, by whoever eventually wrote the case study. The outside counsel, Paul Stringer, presented the legal landscape for 40 minutes. The FAA findings were now formally on the record, and the acknowledgement Victoria had submitted. Thursday morning had been received and confirmed. The criminal exposure centered on the authorization chain above the maintenance level, specifically on Damien Cross's written and verbal directives during Q4 that had created the conditions for the documentation falsification and unauthorized parts sourcing. The question of whether Victoria's own conduct met any threshold of regulatory liability was, Stringer said carefully, being assessed, but the preliminary indication was that her exposure was significantly lower given that her role in the documentation decisions appeared to have been indirect. Appeared to have been, said one of the board members, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had been on the board for 7 years and who asked the questions other board members were thinking but didn't always say. Based on current evidence, Stringer said, that can change as the investigation develops. Is it going to change? Stringer looked at his notes. I have no reason to believe it will, based on what we currently have. Eleanor looked at Victoria. And Damien? Victoria answered because it was her answer to give. He's cooperating with federal investigators. He has his own counsel. What that cooperation looks like and what it means for his situation is between him and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Are you going to fight to keep him? No, Victoria said. It came out immediately, without the calculation that usually preceded her answers. His employment with Continental Vantage is terminated, effective this morning. The board can vote to formalize that now. The vote took 3 minutes. It was unanimous. There was a silence after the vote that wasn't relief, exactly. More like the particular solemnity of a room full of people who understand they're at a turning point and don't know yet which way the turn is going. Henry Aldrich spoke into that silence. I want to address something before we move to the operational items, he said. I've been chair of this board through a major incident before, 12 years ago. I know what recovery looks like from the inside, and I know what it requires. What it requires, the actual thing, not the press release version, is that the people leading this organization accept that something went wrong not because of one person's decisions, but because of a culture that allowed those decisions to be made. Damien made specific choices, but the conditions that made those choices possible, the pressure on timelines, the treatment of safety as a cost variable, the way a consultant who found a real problem was publicly humiliated instead of listened to, those conditions don't begin and end with one COO. They begin and end with us. He looked around the table. We are going to do this recovery correctly, or we are not going to do it at all. And doing it correctly means starting with an honest accounting of how we got here, not a narrative that puts everything on one person who is conveniently no longer in the building. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Eleanor Voss said, What does that look like operationally? It starts with the inspector, Henry said. He looked at Victoria. I want Ethan Mercer back in this company in a meaningful role. Not as a gesture, not as optics, because he is the right person for whatever we build next. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've already put thought into that. Damien Cross appeared at the federal courthouse for a preliminary hearing on fraud charges related to the documentation falsification and the unauthorized procurement authorization at 11:15 Thursday morning. His attorney made a brief statement. Damien said nothing to the reporters outside, which was the correct legal strategy and also the only thing left to him. The local news ran the footage at noon, a man in a gray overcoat walking past cameras with his head down. A month ago, he'd been the COO of one of the 12 largest airlines in North America. Now he was a defendant. He'd made decisions during Q4 that he told himself were justifiable under operational pressure. He'd created a timeline that couldn't be met honestly and then looked away from the ways his people were meeting it dishonestly. He hadn't instructed anyone to falsify records in so many words. He'd understood that if he didn't instruct them explicitly, there was a layer of deniability, a gap between what he knew and what he'd formally authorized. That gap had felt like protection. It was turning out to be the opposite. He sat in the back seat of his attorney's car outside the courthouse and stared through the window at the street. His attorney was talking through the next steps, what the cooperation discussion with the U.S. Attorney's Office would involve, what the timeline looked like. Damien heard the words but wasn't really following them yet. He was thinking about Tuesday morning, about standing at that podium and saying fundamental misunderstanding of his role and within normal operational parameters with the confidence of a man who believed he could frame a cracked landing gear into something manageable. He genuinely believed that. Standing there in the lobby with the cameras on him, he genuinely believed the framing was defensible. He didn't believe it anymore. His attorney said his name. He turned from the window. Sorry, he said. Go ahead. Gerald Pham went back to work on Thursday. Not to the hangar. The Harlow maintenance operation was still under the FAA's review umbrella, and access was restricted for non-essential personnel, but to the administrative building, where he spent the morning in a meeting with Continental Vantage's legal team going over his timeline and his documentation. He was a cooperating witness, not a target, at least not currently. He'd told the FAA everything he knew, which turned out to be more than he'd realized he knew once he started talking. He'd worked in aviation maintenance management for 22 years. He'd never been involved in anything like this. He'd told himself for months that the Q4 shortcuts were within the range of normal operational compression, that every airline did things under pressure that were slightly outside the line, and that the line itself had some give in it. He told himself that right up until Tuesday morning when Ethan's call came in, and he'd known in his gut, even before the physical inspection confirmed it, that the line didn't have that much give. He sat in the Continental Vantage legal conference room and answered questions, and thought about Ethan calling him at 8:15 on Tuesday with a voice like a man who had already decided. He thought about what he'd said. "We've got a 9:15 departure. You understand what a ground stop means," and about how Ethan had said the aircraft doesn't fly and hung up, just like that. Like the math was done and the answer was settled and there was nothing else to discuss. Gerald had been mildly furious at the time. He was not furious anymore. He'd called Ethan's cell phone twice since Tuesday. Ethan hadn't answered either time, which was fair. He'd left a voicemail the second time that he suspected hadn't been listened to yet. He didn't blame him. What he'd said in the voicemail was approximately, "I know this probably doesn't mean much right now, but what you did on Tuesday was the right call and I should have supported it instead of pushing back. I'm sorry I didn't." He'd paused for a moment on the voicemail, then added, "I hope you're okay," then hung up. He wasn't sure what he expected from that. Probably nothing. But he'd needed to say it somewhere other than inside his own head. Ethan listened to Gerald's voicemail. Thursday afternoon, sitting on the back steps of his house in the cold, with a cup of tea because he'd made too much coffee already. The yard was brown and dormant, the way March yards are before anything starts coming back. There was a bird feeder that he and Lily had put up last spring and that he'd been inconsistent about refilling. It was empty now. He listened to the voicemail twice, then he saved it, which he didn't always do. He thought about calling Gerald back, decided to wait. There would be time for those conversations when the federal process had sorted out who owed what to whom. Right now, the cleanest thing was to keep his distance from anyone still inside the investigation perimeter. Tom Bryce came by at 4 o'clock, which he'd texted to ask about first. He brought coffee from the place near his house that Ethan liked, and they sat at the kitchen table the way they'd sat at kitchen tables 100 times over the years. Not quite formally, not quite casually, the way colleagues sit who have been colleagues long enough to have a comfortable shorthand. "Board meeting ended at 1, Tom said. "I've got a source inside. Crosses out. Criminal referral confirmed. The board voted on a compliance review package that includes a full audit and a restructuring of the maintenance certification chain." "What kind of restructuring?" "The word they're using is redundancy. No more single-point certification authority, multiple sign-off chains, independent review tracks, more like what the federal system uses." Tom wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "They should have had that to begin with. The whole setup they had with you was efficient but fragile. One person walks out the door and everything stops." "Now, in this case, that was probably a feature," Ethan said. Tom looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "In this case." They were quiet for a moment. "I got a call this morning from someone at the airline," Tom said. He kept his voice neutral. "Henry Aldrich's office." Ethan waited. "They want to talk to you about a role," Tom said. "Not the consulting contract, something internal, senior level. The phrase used was Director of Safety Operations, but I don't think the title is settled. What's settled is that they want you inside the organization with actual authority, not a contractor relationship." Ethan looked at his coffee. "You don't have to say anything right now," Tom said. "I'm just passing it along." "I know. It's a real offer. Henry Aldrich is not a man who makes gestures. If he wants you in the building, it's because he understands what it means to have someone in the building who does what you did." "What I did," Ethan said, "was read a maintenance log and look at a landing gear. That's the job. That's just the job." "Most people in your position don't do the job the way you did it," Tom said. "That's the whole point." Ethan got up and went to the window. The yard was still dormant, still brown, the bird feeder still empty. He made a mental note to fill it before Lily noticed. "If I go back in there," he said, not really to Tom, more working it out in real time, "it can't be symbolic. It can't be the airline putting a face on a reform program so the news cycle moves on. The certification process, the documentation standards, the way mechanics are treated when they raise concerns up the chain, all of it has to actually change. Or I'm just their press release. Tell them that, Tom said. I will. Good. Tom took a long drink of his coffee. Then you should take the meeting. What? The meeting with Henry Aldrich happened Friday morning at 8 in a conference room at Continental Vantage headquarters. That was not the 38th floor executive suite where the board sessions happened. Aldrich had chosen a smaller room on the 19th floor, plainer, with a view of the parking structure rather than the skyline. Ethan appreciated the choice without knowing if it was intentional. Aldrich was 70 years old, with white hair and the careful, economical movements of a man who had learned not to waste energy on things that didn't matter. He'd been running boards for 20 years. He had the quality that some men develop in the 7th decade of their lives of seeming entirely unhurried by anything, not because they don't care, but because they've learned that urgency is often the enemy of clarity. They shook hands. They sat. Aldrich had a folder in front of him that he didn't open. I'm not going to waste your morning with a sales pitch, Aldrich said. You know why you're here. I want to understand what it would take for you to say yes. Ethan had thought about this carefully. He'd made a list the night before, sitting at his kitchen table after Lily was in bed, the same way he drafted inspection reports, methodically, without editorializing, just the requirements as he actually understood them. He laid it out. Genuine authority over the certification process, not advisory, not consultative, but operational authority with a direct reporting line to the board's safety committee, bypassing the COO chain that had created the problem in the first place. A written policy protecting any employee or contractor who raised a documented safety concern from retaliation with teeth, meaning independent review and real consequences for violations. A mandatory escalation path that required any grounded aircraft finding to be reviewed by an independent technical authority within 4 hours, eliminating the kind of pressure conversation that had happened with Carla Simmons Tuesday morning. And a compensation structure that was internal, not contract-based, because independent contractors could be terminated for being inconvenient, and he was not going to put himself in that position again. He laid all of it out clearly and without apology. He wasn't negotiating. He was describing the conditions under which the role would actually mean something. Aldrich listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the board chair sat for a moment looking at the closed folder in front of him. The reporting line is straightforward, he said. I'll draft it myself. The whistleblower policy. We should have had that years ago, and I take responsibility for the board not requiring it. The technical review escalation, yes. The employment structure, yes. He paused. The compensation will be fair, and it will be in writing before you sign anything. I'd want an attorney to review it, Ethan said. Of course, Aldrich said, as if that were obvious. And I want it understood. By you, by whoever replaces Damian Cross in operations, by the entire maintenance management chain, that my job is not to make the airline's schedule work. My job is to make the airline safe. Those two things will usually be compatible. When they're not, safety wins, every time, without a conversation. Aldrich looked at him for a moment with the slightly evaluative quality of someone listening for whether the words match the person saying them. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. There was a silence. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Go ahead. Why me specifically? You could recruit someone from the federal system with a higher profile, Patricia Huang, someone with more name recognition coming out of this. Aldrich looked at the folder. Because the people with high name recognition coming out of this will bring their public profile into the role and spend half their energy managing it. You walked out of that airport on Tuesday and went home and made your daughter a sandwich. He glanced up. I had someone look into what you did after. You filed your report. You answered the FAA's questions. You didn't give interviews. You didn't leverage the situation. He paused. That tells me something about why you do the work. Ethan didn't say anything to that. Also, Aldrich said, and there was something in his voice that was almost dry. You already know where all the problems are in our system. There's a learning curve value to that. Ethan almost smiled. There is, he said. They talked for another 40 minutes about the specifics, structure, timeline, transition plan for the certification review that was still ongoing, how his role would interact with the FAA's oversight during the correction period. It was practical, detailed conversation, the kind Ethan was comfortable with. When he stood to leave, Aldrich stood too. "One more thing," Aldrich said. "Victoria asked me to tell you, separately from the official offer, separately from any legal context, that she meant what she said to you yesterday, that the apology was real." Ethan nodded. "She's not an easy person," Aldrich said. "She's been harder than she needed to be on a lot of people over a lot of years, and this week has cost her in ways she'll be sorting out for a while. But she's not dishonest. When she says she was wrong, she was wrong." "I believed her," Ethan said. "That's why I came to the meeting." Aldrich extended his hand. "We'll have the draft terms to your attorney by Monday." Ethan shook his hand. "I'll let you know by Wednesday." He took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the cold morning air. The sky had cleared overnight, and the light was thin and sharp the way March light is when winter is almost done and spring hasn't quite decided to commit. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. He called Lily's school. Not to say anything, just checking in, the way he sometimes did when things had been uncertain enough that he needed to hear that she was simply there, in a classroom, doing long division, annoyed by the steps, worried about nothing bigger than a quiz. Carol, the secretary, answered and said Lily was fine and had in fact gotten 100 on her math quiz, and that she'd been quite proud of herself about it, and had mentioned to her teacher that her dad had helped her study. He hadn't, really. He'd just sat with her while she worked. But he'd take it. He put his phone in his pocket and stood in the light for another moment. Then he got in his truck and drove home to fill the bird feeder before she got out of school. He filled the bird feeder that Friday afternoon with a bag of seed he found in the garage behind the winter coats, and he stood in the backyard for a few minutes watching nothing in particular while the cold worked its way through his jacket. The yard was still mostly brown. A few things at the edges were starting to think about coming back. Some kind of ground cover near the fence that was showing the faint suggestion of green if you looked at the right angle in the right light. Not quite yet. Almost. He went inside and made dinner before Lily got home from school. Nothing complicated. Pasta, the kind she liked with the butter and the parmesan, a salad she would eat approximately half of and declare sufficient. He set the table the way he always did, 2-place settings. Her water glass slightly closer to the edge than his because she liked to be able to reach it without stretching. She came through the door at 4:20 with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and the specific energy of a child who had been holding something in all day and was now ready to release it. "I got 100, she said, before she'd even put her bag down. "I heard," he said. She stopped. "You called the school again?" "Just checking in." She dropped her bag by the door, which he'd given up asking her not to do. "You always call when something's going on." "Something's always going on." She came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter and looked at him with those evaluating eyes. "Is everything okay? Like, for real?" He turned from the stove. "Yeah," he said. "For real. Things are settling down." "Are you going back to work?" "I'm thinking about it." "At the airport?" "At the airline, yeah, different job, better job, maybe." She seemed to weigh this. "Are the mean people still there?" He almost smiled. "Some of them. But it's a big place." She thought about it a moment longer, then apparently decided it was settled, because she picked her bag back up and headed for her room and called back over her shoulder. "Can we make more airplanes after dinner?" "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." He turned back to the stove and listened to her footsteps down the hall and thought about how much of his life, the real life, not the professional one, happened in this narrow, ordinary corridor of small sounds and small rituals. The inhaler on the nightstand, the lunch note in the front pocket, the paper airplanes on the windowsill. This was the thing he protected when he crouched in a hangar at 6:45 in the morning with a flashlight on a landing gear. Not an abstraction, not a principle, just the specific weight of people who were going home to something, or going somewhere that mattered to them, and who had no idea that the margin between that and something else could be a hairline fracture in a housing component, and one person's willingness to stay in the room with what they found. He stirred the pasta and didn't think about it anymore that evening. He sent his acceptance to Henry Aldrich's office on Wednesday, as he'd said he would. His attorney, a woman named Claire Simons, who handled employment contracts and who had been recommended by Tom Bryce, had reviewed the draft terms over the weekend and come back with 4 modifications, all of which Aldrich's team accepted without significant pushback. Claire had said, with the mild surprise of someone accustomed to harder negotiations, that the airline appeared to be negotiating in good faith. "Don't let that catch you off guard," Ethan had said. It's just unusual, she said. The situation is unusual, he said. They know it. The formal offer letter arrived Thursday. He signed it Thursday afternoon. His start date was set for the following Monday, which was aggressive but reflected the FAA's requirement that the certification correction process have a named responsible authority inside Continental Vantage within 30 days of the formal findings, a deadline that was now 2 weeks away. He called Tom Bryce to tell him. Good, Tom said, simply, the way Tom said things when he meant them. I want you to know, Ethan said, that if you hadn't posted that thing on the forum Tuesday evening about working with me for 9 years, I don't know if the story stays in the framing that Continental Vantage put on it. The rogue inspector thing might have held longer. It wouldn't have held, Tom said. The fracture was always going to come out. Maybe, but you put your name on it before the investigation confirmed anything. That mattered. Tom was quiet for a moment. You'd have done the same, he said. I'd have tried to, Ethan said. I'm not sure I'd have been as fast. Tom made a dismissive sound. You walked into that concourse and refused to kneel in front of 200 people in a row of cameras. Don't tell me you'd have been too slow to post on a forum. Ethan let that sit. Fair enough, he said. His first day back at Harlow International as Director of Flight Safety was not dramatic. He drove the same route he'd driven the morning of the incident, passed the same gas station and the same park with the same broken swing, arrived at the same security gate he'd badged through a dozen times, and walked into a building he knew. But the badge was different. Not a contractor's access credential with a quarterly expiration, but a full employee identification with his name and title and a security level that got him through doors that had been closed to him before. His office was on the 3rd floor of the operations building, not far from where the maintenance supervisors worked. He'd asked for that proximity specifically. He didn't want to be on the executive floor. He wanted to be where the work happened, close enough to the people who did it that they could stop by without it feeling like a formal event. The office itself was a standard corporate space. Desk, 2 chairs, a window looking out at the service road rather than the terminal. Someone had put a plant on the desk that he was fairly confident he was going to kill within a month, but he appreciated the gesture. Gerald Pham knocked on the door at 8:15. Ethan had thought about this moment. He'd known Gerald would come. Gerald wasn't the kind of man to avoid something uncomfortable, which was one of the things that had gotten him into the situation and also one of the things that had eventually gotten him out of it. He'd cooperated fully with the FAA. He'd told the truth about the authorization chain above him. His own exposure was limited but real, and the question of what Continental Vantage did with him internally was one that Ethan had been asked, informally, to weigh in on. Gerald stood in the doorway. He was a solidly built man in his mid-50s who looked like he'd slept about as well as Ethan had over the past week and a half. Come in, Ethan said. Gerald came in and sat in one of the 2 chairs across from the desk. He had his hands on his knees and he wasn't quite sure where to look, which Ethan recognized as the body language of a man who has something he needs to say and isn't sure if he's earned the right to say it yet. I listened to your voicemail, Ethan said, saving him the approach. Both of them. Gerald nodded. I meant what I said. I know you did. A pause. I should have backed you up on the call, Gerald said. When you told me the aircraft wasn't going, I should have said, okay, what do you need? Instead, I pushed on the schedule. You were doing your job, Ethan said. The problem wasn't that you questioned me. The problem was that the system above you had already decided the answer before anyone asked the question. I knew something was off, Gerald said. Not about the aircraft specifically. I didn't know about the fracture. But the Q4 pressure, the way the timelines were running, I knew something wasn't adding up. I told myself it was above my pay grade. Was it? Gerald looked at him. No, he said. I had enough seniority to push back. I didn't. Okay, Ethan said, not to absolve him, just to acknowledge it. What happens to me? Gerald asked. Not defensively, just directly. That's above my pay grade, Ethan said, and Gerald made a short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. What I can tell you is that the people who asked my opinion got it, and my opinion is that the people who told the truth when it mattered are different from the people who built the situation in the first place. What you do from here matters more than what you did then. Gerald nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. I've worked in this building for 18 years, he said. I've never had anything like this on my record. I know. I don't want it to be how I end. Then make sure it isn't, Ethan said, simply. The way you say a thing that is true and doesn't require decoration. Gerald stood. They shook hands. It was not the handshake of two men who had resolved everything between them. That would take longer and might not ever be fully complete. But it was the handshake of two people who understood where they stood and were willing to work from there. The first month was hard in the specific way that doing a real job under public scrutiny is hard. The FAA's correction deadline focused everyone's attention in ways that were useful but also exhausting. Every meeting had a regulatory weight to it. Every decision was being documented for the oversight file. And Ethan was in 5 or 6 conversations a day that required him to be both technically authoritative and diplomatically careful, which were not always skills that wanted to coexist. He rebuilt the certification chain from the inside out. The new structure had 3 independent sign-off paths, no single point of failure, and a mandatory physical verification requirement before any documentation could be completed, meaning the sequence Dennis Farrow had described, where the record preceded the inspection, was now structurally impossible. It wasn't enough to make it against policy. He'd built it so the system itself refused to allow it. He brought in 2 additional inspectors from the federal contractor pool, both women he knew from his FAA years, who were exacting and experienced and did not care about departure schedules in the way he needed them not to care. He spent 2 weeks walking through the documentation protocols with the maintenance shift supervisors, not lecturing, just sitting down with them in small groups and going through specific scenarios and asking what they would do and listening to the answers and correcting gently when the answers weren't right. He found, in those conversations, that most of the people doing the work understood the right answers. They'd been working in a culture where the right answers weren't always the safe ones to give. That was the thing that needed to change, and it couldn't be changed with a policy memo. It had to be changed in rooms, in conversations, by the slow accumulation of evidence that the person at the top of the safety chain actually meant what he said. He meant what he said. When a junior technician named Yolanda Reyes flagged a documentation discrepancy in her 3rd week on the job, a minor one, not safety critical, but real, and was uncertain whether to raise it formally, a coworker told her to bring it to Mercer's office directly. She did, nervous, holding a printed report. Ethan looked at it, confirmed the discrepancy, thanked her, sent her a formal written acknowledgement of her report within the hour, and had the issue corrected and documented before the end of the day. Word moved through the maintenance floor the way word moves through any workplace, faster and more thoroughly than any official channel. Within a week, 2 more discrepancies had been flagged by technicians who would not have flagged them 2 months ago. That was when Ethan knew the thing he was building had a foundation. Damian Cross's case moved through the federal system at the pace such cases move, methodically, without drama, with a great deal of paperwork and waiting and carefully worded filings. He'd entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, which meant he was providing testimony about the authorization chain in exchange for consideration on the charges he faced. The cooperation was real, according to sources Tom Bryce had in the federal system, meaning Damian was giving them everything rather than the minimum required to be technically compliant. Whether that reflected genuine remorse or strategic calculation was something only Damian Cross knew, and possibly he didn't know either. People rarely understand their own motivations as cleanly as they'd like to. What was clear was that the cooperation was substantive, and that the picture it completed of the Q4 decision chain was thorough enough to close the investigation's outstanding questions about who authorized what and when. The formal charges included wire fraud and making false statements to federal regulators, both related to the documentation falsification and the procurement authorization. His attorney had said in public filings that his client accepted responsibility for the decisions made and their consequences. The sentencing would come later. The legal system was in no hurry. On the day the cooperation agreement was publicly disclosed, Ethan was in a meeting with the maintenance supervisors and didn't see the news until 6 in the evening. He read the headline, read the first 2 paragraphs of the story, and set his phone face down on the kitchen counter. Lily was at the table doing homework. He made dinner. He didn't think about Damian Cross for the rest of the evening, not because he was suppressing it, but because there wasn't anything left to think about. The man had done what he'd done. The consequences were what they were. The fracture had been real. The 218 passengers had gone home to their lives, or started their vacations, or made their business meetings, from other flights on other days, never knowing how close the math had come. That was what mattered. The rest was legal process, and legal process didn't need his attention. But Victoria Langford was a different story, not a simpler one. She remained CEO of Continental Vantage, which was a decision that the board had made with clear eyes and which Ethan had been asked about informally and had said, also with clear eyes, that the question of executive leadership was not his domain and he wouldn't let it become his domain. What he knew about Victoria was that she had told him the truth in that hotel restaurant and that she'd meant the apology and that she was working in ways he could see, though she'd never said so directly to him, to be a different kind of leader than she'd been on the Tuesday morning she'd pointed her finger across a gate area and asked a man to kneel. She attended the safety committee briefings personally, which she hadn't done in years according to people who'd been in the company long enough to know. Not performatively. She came prepared, asked technical questions, listened to the answers without interrupting. She'd hired a new COO, a woman named Rachel Dorn from outside the airline industry, specifically because she wanted someone without entrenched assumptions about how the operations and safety balance should work. Rachel was difficult in the way genuinely competent people are difficult. Full of opinions, not deferential, willing to tell Victoria when she was wrong. Victoria, from what Ethan could see, was letting her. He had a brief exchange with Victoria in the hallway outside a safety committee meeting in his second month, a Tuesday morning, which he noticed without saying anything. She stopped him with a question about the FAA's timeline for lifting the last of the oversight conditions, and they stood in the hallway for 5 minutes talking through the regulatory process with the practical clarity of two people who had a shared interest in the outcome. At the end of it, she said, not in the formal tone of the executive hallway, but in something quieter. How are you finding the role? It's what I thought it was going to be, he said. Hard in the right ways. She nodded. I wanted to say, I think what you're doing in the maintenance building is real. The people I talk to down there speak about the culture differently than they did before. That's not nothing. It's early, he said. I know, she said, but early is where it starts. He looked at her for a moment. This was not the woman who had stood in Terminal C with her finger pointed. Or rather, it was, but there was something in her now that hadn't been visible then, or that she hadn't been allowing to be visible. A kind of accountability that she was wearing on the surface rather than managing from behind it. It had cost her something to get there. He wasn't going to pretend it hadn't, and he didn't think she was pretending either. Thank you, he said. He meant it plainly, without subtext. She nodded once, and they went to their separate meetings. Dennis Farrow kept his job. It was not a foregone conclusion. The investigation had put his name in the record as the technician who installed the non-certified component, and while his cooperation and the evidence about the authorization chain above him had shaped the legal outcome significantly, Continental Vantage's internal HR process had still had to make a determination about his employment. Ethan had been asked. He'd said what he'd said to Gerald, that the people who told the truth when it mattered were different from the people who built the situation, and had added that the airline needed to think carefully about what message it sent to its technical staff if the person who came forward voluntarily and told the complete truth was treated the same as someone who had tried to conceal the same information. Dennis was moved to a different role, not in active maintenance certification, not immediately, which was the right call, but in the maintenance training program, where his 15 years of hands-on experience was directly useful and where his understanding of exactly how pressure documentation could go wrong made him, Ethan thought, probably the best person in the building to teach the next generation of technicians about what to do when someone above them in the chain tells them something that doesn't add up. He'd been nervous when Ethan's office called to tell him about the reassignment. He'd expected termination. When it became clear what was actually being offered, he'd been quiet on the phone for long enough that Ethan's assistant had checked to see if he was still there. He was still there. He was just taking a moment. He came by Ethan's office a week into the new role to say thank you. Ethan told him he didn't need to thank him, that the decision had been made by people above both of them and was the right call for the program. Dennis said he understood that, but that he'd heard Ethan had advocated for it, and he'd wanted to say something in person. Okay, Ethan said. You've said it. Dennis smiled, a little awkwardly. I keep thinking about those 218 people, he said. Yeah, Ethan said. Me too, sometimes. Does it get easier? Ethan thought about the honest answer. It becomes background, he said. You learn to do the work without carrying every scenario all the time, or you burn out before you're any use to anybody. But it doesn't. You don't stop knowing it. You just learn to let it be what it is, the thing that tells you why the work matters, without being the thing that paralyzes you while you're doing it. Dennis nodded slowly. That's what I'm trying to figure out. You've got time, Ethan said. Do the training program. Be honest with the new techs about what happened. Not the institutional version, the real version. What you actually thought when you were standing there looking at that part number. What if they lose respect for me? Some of them might, Ethan said. But the ones who matter will understand that the story you're telling them is more useful than any version where you got it right the first time. Dennis left the office looking like a man who had a lot to think about, which was probably about right. The FAA lifted the last of the formal oversight conditions on Continental Vantage's Harlow operation on a Thursday morning in May, 2 months after the incident. The lift was conditional, quarterly review reports required for the following year with independent verification, but it was a formal acknowledgement that the corrective structure was in place and functioning. Castillo called Ethan directly when the paperwork went through. Looks solid, he said. What you've built in the documentation chain is what we'd want to see from an operation that understands what happened and why. We're not done, Ethan said. No, Castillo agreed, but you're past the beginning. Ethan thanked him and hung up and looked out the window of his third-floor office at the service road and the planes moving on the tarmac in the distance. It was a bright May morning, the kind that feels like the year has finally decided to commit to itself after months of hesitation. There were 3 departures queued at the far end of the runway he could see from his window, and he watched them without urgency. 3 planes in line, waiting their turn, each one carrying the weight of everyone inside it toward wherever they were going. He'd stop doing the calculation every time he saw a plane take off. Not because the math didn't matter anymore, but because the math was built into the process now. The right people doing the right work in the right order with the right documentation. And his job was to make sure that stayed true, rather than to run the failure analysis in his head every morning for the rest of his career. He had a meeting in 20 minutes with the new certification team leads. He had a draft policy revision on his desk that needed his signature. He had a call with the FAA oversight coordinator scheduled for 2 o'clock. He had a daughter who, at pickup that afternoon, was going to tell him about the science project she'd been preparing for 2 weeks, something about weather patterns and the formation of clouds, and who had asked him the night before to quiz her on the key terms, which he'd done for 45 minutes at the kitchen table while she corrected him twice when he mispronounced cumulonimbus. He stood at his window for another minute watching the planes. The first one in the queue moved. It rolled forward, gathered itself, and then with the particular force and commitment of a thing that has decided, it lifted off the runway and rose into the bright morning air, clean and certain, on its way somewhere that mattered to someone. He watched it until it was small enough to be just a point of light against the sky. Then he went back to his desk and got to work. There is a version of this story that ends with a speech, with someone standing at a podium saying the right things in the right order, and an audience moved to applause, and a neat line drawn under everything that happened. Life doesn't usually end that way, and neither do the things inside it that actually change people. What actually happened was quieter and more durable than a speech. A man who understood what he was looking at refused to look away from it, at a cost he didn't know in advance, and accepted anyway. That's not heroism in the cinematic sense. It's not bravery in the way that word gets used about people who run into burning buildings. It's something more ordinary and more demanding. The willingness to be the person who says the true thing in the room where the true thing is inconvenient, without knowing whether anyone will back you up, without the guarantee that the outcome will justify what it costs. Ethan Mercer didn't save 218 lives by performing courage. He saved them by doing his job the way his job was supposed to be done, even when every institutional pressure in the room was pointing in the other direction. The thing that made him different wasn't that he was braver than anyone else. It was that he had been doing the work long enough and honestly enough that he couldn't pretend the fracture wasn't there once he'd seen it. He didn't have a way to unknow it. Some people develop that ability over the course of a career. The ability to look at something true and find a way to see it as negotiable. He'd never developed it, and by the time he was standing in Hangar 7 at 7 in the morning with a flashlight, he was old enough to know he wasn't going to. The cost of that is real. It cost him a job, temporarily. It cost him 2 weeks of public exposure he hadn't wanted. It cost him the comfort of easy professional relationships with people who would have preferred he'd done the simpler thing. He paid all of it without complaint, not because he was indifferent to it, but because he understood. The way you understand things that have been tested against actual circumstances rather than just believed in abstractly, that some costs are how you know the thing you're protecting is real. Victoria Langford learned something. That's worth saying, because not everyone does. She'd spent 14 years building an airline on the premise that she was the smartest person in any given room and that her reading of a situation was more reliable than anyone else's, and she'd been right often enough that she'd stopped questioning it. She'd been wrong about Ethan in a way that the entire industry had watched in real time, and she'd had to decide what to do with that. She could have managed it externally until the news cycle moved on. She chose not to. It made her smaller in the short term and larger in the long term, and she was still sorting out what that trade meant for who she was going to be in the years she had left in the role. Henry Aldrich said something to her privately, in the weeks after the incident, that she thought about more than she expected to. He'd said, "The problem with always being right is that it teaches you that the system of checking is for other people." She'd written it down, which wasn't something she normally did with things people said to her. She'd put it in a drawer. She took it out occasionally and looked at it and put it back. Dennis Farrow taught his first training session in May, 3 weeks after moving to the new role. He stood in front of 14 new maintenance technicians and told them about the Q4 directive and the part number and the conversation with Ray, and what he'd thought when he was standing in the hangar holding a component from a supplier he knew wasn't approved. He told it without softening it. He told it as a story about what you tell yourself when you're under pressure, and what happens when what you tell yourself turns out to be wrong. One of the trainees asked him what he wished he'd done differently. He said, "I wish I'd written it down. I wish I'd put the question on paper and sent it up the chain with my name on it. Because the moment you make it formal, the moment it exists somewhere outside your own head, everything changes. They can ignore a question you ask verbally. They can't ignore a question that's documented." He still coached his son's soccer team on Saturdays. His son was 15 now, and faster than Dennis had ever been. He stood on the sideline in the cold Saturday mornings and watched his son run and thought about the paper he'd put in the drawer for 3 months and never signed his name to, and then he thought about something else, because there was only so much of that kind of thinking a person could sustain before it stopped being useful. Lily Mercer's science project was about cumulonimbus cloud formation and its relationship to thunderstorm development. She presented it on a Tuesday in May, and her teacher gave her the highest grade in the class, and she told Ethan about it in the car on the way home with the specific combination of pride and casual delivery that children use when they're pleased about something but don't want to seem like they care too much. She said it was the most thorough, Lily said. "I believe it," Ethan said. "She said most kids just printed something from the internet. You did more than that." "I know," she said. Then, with the sideways look that reminded him of exactly. No one he could name, but felt familiar in a way that might just be the specific character of being her. "Because you always say if you're going to do something, actually do it." "Yeah," he said, "I say that." "It's a good rule," she said, with the authoritative tone of someone who has evaluated many rules and reached a verdict. He drove, and she looked out the window at the May afternoon, already moving on to the next thing in her head, already somewhere else. He let her go. The paper airplanes were still on her windowsill when they got home. One of them had fallen on its side at some point, and he reached past her when she wasn't looking and set it back upright, the way you do with small things that have toppled, quietly, without making it into something. Outside, a plane crossed the sky, high and bright in the afternoon light, trailing its thin line of white behind it. He watched it from the window until it was gone.